Hi, welcome back to our lecture. This is Jason Baker, and I'm talking about pipelines in Jenkins. So traditionally, when we would create these pipelines within Jenkins, we would define our jobs or projects, and for each project, we would define multiple steps, multiple build steps. And oftentimes what we would do is we would actually link different projects together. There's a way to configure a project so that when the project is done, it actually triggers the building of another project. And so by linking these different projects together, we could create a sort of a defined pipeline with different stages. But now within Jenkins, we can actually create a project which is a pipeline project, and within that pipeline, we can define multiple stages. And what you'll find is that you can actually create pipelines using code. So, you know, up until now, when we've been building these projects, we've been going in and modifying the configuration of a project. But instead of modifying the configuration of a project, we can actually create a code file which describes how that project will execute a build. So let's start going down the route of figuring out how to build a pipeline within Jenkins. And you can build a pipeline in Jenkins by using the pipeline DSL, which is a domain-specific language. And the benefit of using the pipeline DSL is that instead of the project configuration hiding in some XML file deep within the Jenkins platform, now the configuration of the project is contained within a source code file. And you can now commit and you can actually version that source control file. And oftentimes the pipeline configuration code is stored right alongside of the application code. So if I have a repository and I need to build the software code in a repository, the pipeline configuration that's required to actually build that software code is stored right alongside of the software code in the very same repository. And the great thing about the DSL is that it allows us to share and reuse pipeline configurations with other team members. So there, when we're creating this pipeline code, we store it in something called a Jenkins file. And typically that Jenkins file is located in the root folder, the root directory of a code repository. The the code within the Jenkins file is based on the Groovy programming language. And Groovy Groovy can compile natively and run on the Java virtual machine. So since Jenkins is running within a Java virtual machine, we can write Groovy code and compile that and run that on a Java virtual machine as well. There are two different types of Jenkins pipeline DSLs that are available to us. There's a declarative pipeline DSL and a scripted pipeline DSL. The declarative pipeline DSL is simpler to use, and the scripted DSL is much more complex. It's more advanced. Now, in practice, I tend to use the scripted DSL much more often. But in this class, we use the declarative DSL. And that's not to say that the declarative DSL isn't useful or isn't really powerful. It's actually widely used. It's by organizations. It's just that for the kind of things that I'm doing, I typically need some more of the advanced capabilities in the scripted DSL. So when we're creating and writing code in that Jenkins file and we're creating a pipeline, there are a couple key terms that you need to understand. Uh, when we're defining our pipeline using the pipeline DSL, we are creating steps. And a step is essentially, think of a step as being a single build task that Jenkins will execute during a build. We also define a node, and the node tells Jenkins where it should run the build for the job. I mentioned earlier that usually you have multiple slave nodes, and each one of those nodes has a label associated with it. So when you define the node within the pipeline DSL, you're going to associate it with one of those node labels. And then we have an agent that you can define. An agent tells Jenkins that it should allocate an executor and workspace for the pipeline. And then finally, a stage. And this is probably one of the key elements of the pipeline DSL. You define one or more stages within your pipeline, and each stage is going to define a distinct subset of that pipeline. So this again goes back to what earlier when I talked about there being like a build stage within the pipeline, then a test stage, and then maybe a deploy stage, and so on. Each one of those stages may execute multiple steps, multiple tasks. So a stage will encapsulate a set of steps. Now, some of these pipeline DSL elements are optional. You don't necessarily need to include them in the pipeline. So here's an example of a Jenkins file where we are defining a pipeline. This kind of looks like sort of like JSON code. It's not actually JSON. It's written in a groovy like syntax. So we have a pipeline that we're defining. That pipeline has two stages. We have a build stage and a test stage. In the build stage, we have a single step, which is going to run the shell command, which is the ant command. In this step, we're going to run the junit command and pass it in an argument. There are a number of different commands that you can run within the pipeline DSL. Here's an example of some commands that you can run. There are literally like, a hundred different commands you can run. And if you add more plugins to your Jenkins server, you can actually add more pipeline commands as well. So you can expand the vocabulary of commands that are available by adding additional plugins. So we have the sh command. The sh command tells the build pipeline to run a shell command. So we provide sh followed by the actual command we want to execute, and those are surrounded by quotes, either single or double quoted characters. If these were surrounded in double quotes, then I could also do a variable interpolation as well in that command statement. There's a dir command, a dir command, and so we say dir parentheses and then a directory. And what that will do is Jenkins will run any commands that are encapsulated by that dir command will run those steps within a particular directory. Now, where is that directory located? Well, that directory is located within the workspace. And this is always important to keep in mind. Every time you run a build, that build is going to access a workspace. And that's where all the file manipulation is occurring. And so when you tell Jenkins that it should run a set of commands within a directory, that directory is relative to your workspace. And so you have to sort of like maintain this mental model of what your workspace looks like for your project. The git command will check out a git repository, and it will essentially clone that repository into the project workspace. So I can say git followed by the git repo address, and it will then check out that repo into the project workspace. I can use the echo command to print out messages, and these will be printed out into the build console for my project build. I can set up environment variables for my project using the with environment command or with env command. And so I provide I specify with env, and then encapsulated in parentheses is a list of key values that I want to be set up within my build environment. Then anytime the pipeline runs a build, it will set up these particular environment variables, and those environment variables will be available to any steps that are encapsulated by that with environment command. So this is just a small sampling of different commands that are available. As I said, there are well over 100 different commands that you can use right out of the box, and plugins make other commands available. So there's plenty of possibilities to explore for you and to learn about what some of the other commands might do. So let's go ahead and start building a pipeline using the pipeline DSL. And we're going to go back to our Jenkins server, and we're going to create a new project called the Java-pipeline project. And this one is going to be a pipeline project. Pipeline projects will utilize the pipeline DSL. So we click OK, and Jenkins goes and puts us in the configuration page for our project. We want to specify the GitHub project, and we're going to use the same Java project that we had forked earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this URL for my Java project, and I'm going to paste it in the configuration. We want our project to trigger from GitHub. We've already set up. Remember, we already set up the webhook in GitHub for this particular repository, so we don't need to do that again. But we do need to set up a GitHub hook trigger for our project. So we need to enable the build trigger. And we keep scrolling down, and now we can define our pipeline. For now, we're just going to define a pipeline script, meaning that we're gonna define the pipeline code directly in the project configuration. So one thing I should note is that, sometimes you might be asking, well, how do I define and how do I write a particular command using in the pipeline DSL format? And there's a convenient link you can click on that'll give you some guidance. It's called the pipeline syntax link. If I click on this link, a new page opens, and this opens to a snippet generator. I can use the snippet generator to create small code snippets using the pipeline script code. So this is a way I can sort of like build different pipeline steps. For example, so if I click on the sample step, you can see here are all the different types of commands that I can run within the pipeline. I can select a particular command like the git command, and then I can provide a git repository, which I'll just paste in a repository URL. I don't need to provide credentials since this is a public repository. And then I can say generate pipeline script. And here's the actual pipeline script command. I can copy and paste that then into my pipeline code file, or I can paste it into the script configuration in my project. So pipeline syntax snippet generator is very helpful. I use it all the time. I'm going to go ahead and close that to go back to my pipeline script. Now I've already created a sample script that you can copy and paste into the script configuration. I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I'm going to paste it in. And the only thing that you need to change is you'll need to change the Git repository URL, because this will be specific to your particular repository. So I make that change. And so let's look at this script real quick. At the very top, we have this properties. We have this properties command. That's just some special glue that sets up the build trigger for this pipeline. The important part is the node. So in the node element, we're specifying which node this build should run on, and we're providing it a label which is called Linux. When this pipeline project is triggered, then the build will run on the Linux slave node in our environment. This project has 3 stages. It has a test stage, a build stage, and a results stage. In the test stage, we will run a shell script. Well, first of all, we'll run the git command, which will clone a copy of our repository into the workspace. We'll run a shell script command, which will run the ant unit tests on our repository. Then we'll hit the second stage, and the second stage will run a build. And so we're just simply running the ant command. And then in our third stage, we're going to run the JUnit command, which will generate some JUnit test reports. Basically, this pipeline script is reproducing the freestyle project that we set up earlier in this lecture. But instead of defining each one of those steps within the project configuration, we're defining these steps using the pipeline DSL code. So let's go ahead and save this project. And we're going to run, the first time we run this project, we need to run it and do a manual build, because that will set up the actual GitHub trigger. So I'm running a manual build. You can see that it's running the build. Let me click on this. If I click on console output, then if I have a long running build, I can actually monitor the output from that build in like almost real time. which is really helpful. These builds have been super short, but in the real world, oftentimes a build can take several minutes. I have some builds that I've created in my environment that can take 45 minutes. And so it can be helpful sometimes to be able to monitor the progress of that build by looking at the console output. So let's look at this console output now. The build ran successfully. We know that because the orb is blue. The build cloned the repository. It then ran the unit tests successfully. Then it created a build and a jar file output, and it recorded those test results for our project. So there was our successful build. Now, if I go back to my repository and if I make a change to my, let's say, my README file, and say I made another change and I commit that change, then you can see that again, now my project has been triggered. And a build of my project is pending. Now that you can see the build has been kicked off automatically from GitHub, from that GitHub webhook. So so we're using the pipeline DSL to define the steps for that should occur and for the tasks that should be executed by a build. But the actual pipeline code is still stored as part of the project configuration. Let's go ahead and change that. Normally, we don't want to store the actual pipeline code as part of the project configuration. We'd like to be able to store that code alongside our source code. And we'd like to be able to set up the job so that it will actually pull the pipeline code from the repository. So when it clones the repository, it will also automatically look for that pipeline code. And this is really convenient, right? Because now we could actually like set up another Jenkins server and it could run our build exactly the same way because the whole build process, the entire pipeline configuration is defined in code. And that code isn't stored in Jenkins, it's actually stored in the repository that Jenkins is pulling. We go back to our Jenkins pipeline project and we go back to the configuration of that project. And what we're going to do is we're going to scroll down and we are going to, first of all, we're going to copy, let's go ahead and copy this code. So I'm going to copy this code for safekeeping because I'm going to reuse it. And instead of defining our code in a pipeline script, we are going to define it in, we're going to define our script in a repository. So we're going to select the pipeline script from SCM option. And that's telling the pipeline project that we want to pull the script from a Git repository. So for SCM, we specify that we want to use Git. So for Git, we need to define our repository URL, which is going to be https://github.com, and then our GitHub username /java-project, and we want to use, let's see, we want to use the .git extension on that as well. And we don't need to add any credentials here for our repository. Now, if Jenkins wasn't able to access our repository, it would give us kind of an error message, or a red highlighted error message here telling us that it wasn't able to access the repository. Now, within our repository, we can specify a script path. In this case, the default is a Jenkins file. That's telling the project that it should look for a Jenkins file in this repository, and it will use the code in that Jenkins file to actually build the project. So we can save this. We don't want to build a project right now because there's no Jenkins file in our repository yet. Let's go ahead and fix that. We'll go back to our Git repository. And what I want to do is I want to create a new file in the repository, and that is going to be called a Jenkins file with capital J. And I'm going to go ahead and paste in that code then. This is the code that I had copied that was previously stored within the pipeline configuration. Now that code is going to be stored in a Jenkins file located in the GitHub repository for the project. So I'm going to go ahead and commit this new file. And when I do that, I've made a change to the repository. It's going to trigger a build for the repository. And that build, you can see, ran. So it successfully ran. If I look at the output, then it tells me that that the project was able to obtain a Jenkins file from the Git repository. So it's gonna download that Jenkins file, and then it will essentially execute the build using the pipeline code within that Jenkins file. Very, very convenient. Now, when you're building out these pipelines, typically what you're doing is you're sort of building them stage by stage, step by step. It's generally not the case that you start out by like building the entire pipeline in one fell swoop. Oftentimes you're just sort of like building one stage at a time. And as you're building stages, some of them are inevitably going to fail for various reasons. Maybe you've made a syntax error in your pipeline code, or maybe the command you're wanting to run just isn't working properly because you're not passing the right arguments or whatever. Or maybe there's some defect in your source code and it's not able to actually build your project and compile your project properly. One thing I'll point out is that if you run a build, you have the ability to replay a build. And right now I'm looking at the build page for the third build for my Java pipeline. You see this link called replay. If I click on that link, you can see here's all of the pipeline code that was executed as part of this job. So I could replay this pipeline, and maybe I wanted to make a change to it. So maybe I wanted to remove a step from the pipeline or something, and I could click on run, and then it would actually replay the pipeline with whatever changes I've made. And so this replay feature is very convenient because it allows you to sort of quickly iterate over pipeline changes if you're trying to test or troubleshoot a pipeline. So far, when we've been working with Jenkins, we've been accessing public Git repositories. And when Jenkins accesses a public Git repository, it doesn't need any credentials in order to access that repository, because Anybody in the world can access a public repository. Anybody can freely clone a public repository on GitHub. But for some of the projects that you work on, for probably most of the projects you work on, the Jenkins is not going to be accessing a public repository. It'll actually be accessing a private repository. This might be a private personal or corporate repository. In some of your assignments, and perhaps even on your final challenge, you'll need to access a private repository. And so in order for Jenkins to access a private repository, it needs help in the form of credentials, right? So when you access your private Git repository, you are providing GitHub credentials to access the repo. Jenkins is accessing the repo on your behalf. It also needs credentials. So to set that up, what you need to do is you need to first of all, you need to set up a personal access token within GitHub, within your GitHub account. And that personal access token is a credential that you will provide then to the Jenkins server. Then in your pipeline Git configuration, you will supply Jenkins with that credential. And then finally, when you're using the git command within your pipeline, you will pass that credential as a token into the git command. So let's take a look at how you would do these various steps. I'm going to go back to my my account into GitHub, and I'm going to select my account settings. Click on account settings, and I'm going to click on developer settings, and then finally personal access tokens. So personal access tokens are credentials that I can set up, and I can then use these credentials in software applications. These allow software applications to access the Git repository as if they were me. So I'm going to generate a new token, and I'm going to call it my Jenkins server token. And I need to specify some credential scopes. These are sort of like permissions, that access permissions that are associated with this token. And I need to give it the let's see, I need to give it the repo access, and I'm going to give it the admin repo hook access. And I think that's all I need to give it on here. Also has repo status, so that's already checked. So now I go ahead and I generate a token. And here you can see my token, which has been generated. I'm going to copy that because I need to. I'm going to need to paste that into the Jenkins credentials store. Now I'm going to go back to Jenkins, and I'm going to pretend that this Java pipeline project is a private repository. It's not, but for this example, I'm going to pretend it is. So I'm going to go back into my pipeline, and I'm going to go into the configuration of my pipeline project. And below, where I define the repository that my Jenkins file is located in, if this were a private repository, I would need to provide credentials. And I would do that by adding credentials. So I click on Add, and I select the Jenkins credential provider. And I want to specify some credentials. In this case, I'm going to specify a username with password credential. For the username, I would provide my GitHub username. And then for the password, I would paste in that access token, that personal access token that I generated in GitHub. I would set up an ID, and so I would just say like, GitHub credential, and for my description, something similar, just say like GitHub token. And now I click add. I've clicked add, but it's not actually using that credential yet. I need to select that credential. So you see my GitHub token credential. So now that credential is being used to access this repository. So I can save the pipeline configuration. So that will allow the pipeline to access and download my Jenkins file. But there's one last thing that I need to do, and that is when Jenkins runs and executes the commands in the Jenkins file. Let's go back to that Jenkins file. It's here. Let's see, where is it? I'm going to go back to my Java project, and I'm going to look at my Jenkins file. So Jenkins is going to execute all of the different steps in this Jenkins file. And one of the steps that it's going to execute is this git command, which is telling Jenkins to clone this repository. Now, if this is a private repository, then I would need to pass in some credentials so that it could actually clone this repository properly. So to do that, I need to modify this code. Let's go back to my pipeline, and we're going to click on the pipeline syntax link. And this is going to help us build the little snippet of code that we need to modify that git command. So my sample step, I'm going to select the git command, and I'm going to paste in my repository URL. So let's just copy and paste this URL from the Jenkins file. We want to use the master branch, and this time we want to specify some credentials that we're going to use. So we'll specify the GitHub token credential that I added to the credential store. And now I say generate pipeline script. And now you can see it's specifying the git command, but it's also passing in a credential ID. All I need to do is copy this snippet of code, and then I go back into my Jenkins file, and I'm going to modify it using the GitHub file editor. And I'm just going to overwrite that existing git command with and telling it that it should use the new credentials that I'm provided. I'm going to commit those changes. And that will trigger a new build of my pipeline. Now, again, this is a public project, so these credentials are actually unnecessary, but it doesn't hurt to provide them. As you can see, the build still ran successfully. But this time, when Jenkins ran this build, it actually used the credentials. It kind of passed in the credentials to GitHub. And that's what you'll need to do when you are when you're configuring Jenkins to run with a private repository in your account.